Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. This is our second week with Dana talking about our home, planet Earth, and all the strands that have come together to this glorious moment of now, evolutionarily. So today Dana's going to be talking about the plants. I'm Tracy Sprower with Methow at Home, and what a joy and honor it is to be able to host this show with you, Dana. Thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. And thanks to those of you who have tuned in. Appreciate it. You take the time. I think it's a very worthwhile story. If we're ever talking about the living organisms in the Methow Valley, whether it's plants or animals or microbes or single-celled organisms, it's valuable. It's meaningful. These are living creatures that share the watershed with us and the planet, of course. So I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope I can do them justice. I have 12 pages of notes here. I did read them once this morning. Some of them I took this morning going through the slides. And then I never can look at the notes. It just doesn't work out. I bolded a few things, and I might refer to it on occasion, but just by way of example. So we know this is a paintbrush. And the thing is about any living thing, it's just going to, if you were to untangle the story, find out the story of any living organism, you could probably write a book. So I started looking into this and well, it's just Castanea. The genus is Castanea. Well, where does that come from? So it's a Spanish botanist, Castanea. Yeah, that's where the name comes from. I think any little piece of information about a living organism, plant or otherwise, helps us have some feeling of connection to that living thing. So even if all we know is that this was named after a Spanish botanist, it might be worthwhile. Ultimately, information about a living organism would be endless, but a few facts about this. This is in a family called it's in a family called the Oroboncaceae, Orobonches. Well, I looked that up this morning. What does that name mean? Orobonchi. I've heard it for years, but I never knew what it means. So it's from Greek. Orobos means a vetch, which is, a pea vine. It's a climbing pea vine. And onkos means to strangle. So the orobonchi means a strangling plant. Why? So what is that about? So once again, when you go into some of the information, it is interesting that this is a strangler plant. In what way? Well, it's parasitic. Paintbrushes are hemiparasitic. I had to look up hemi. I know semi, but hemi means half. I don't know if it's half parasitic. It's partly parasitic, but it's also, you can see the leaves are green. That means it's also photosynthetic. The question is, where does it get its food? And the answer is it gets half of it from other plants. It puts out parasitic roots that enter into the cells of other plants without damaging that other plant, that host plant. That's quite remarkable. The paintbrushes they have a high rate of evaporation. So that means nutrients are running up through the plant more quickly. So it actually pulls on the other plants and pulls nutrients out of the other plants. So who knew all this was going on? We thought they were just pretty flowers. But no, they've got this whole complex life history. You can always, with a little bit of information, you can always do some interpretation of a flower. Why is the flower the color and shape that it is? Red is not very visible to insects. In reading about these, it says insects will come to paintbrush, but it's a little bit of a mystery because they don't perceive red very well. But they are pollinated by hummingbirds, which see it very clearly. And it is something of a hummingbird-shaped flower because the nectar is down inside those red bracts. You would think those are petals, but they aren't. Taxonomically speaking, evolutionary speaking, they're just a bunch of bracts. Anyhow, So that's probably parasitic on something. It was on this rock slide, this huge rock slide on the side of Scatter Lake, and there aren't many other plants there. So I don't know what it's hemiparasitic on. But in any case, it's one of our compatriots in the Methow Valley traveling with us through space. And that's the way it goes with any plant. I'm sure you could write a book about any plant. So we have I don't know, it could be up to 10 slides at least before we actually get to the plants of the Methow. I showed this last week, and this is an actual concept of the universe, probably back in the 1300s. The Earth was the center. The Earth was thought to be the center, and the 1300s and before, 1200s, 1100s, all the way back through history. It just seems like we're the center of the universe, and it doesn't work out real well because, for one thing, we aren't, like, by any stretch of the imagination. Uh, and so getting actual information about the planet we live on is valuable. So this is a statue of Giordano Bruno. I forget his dates, 1300, 1400.
Yeah, today it was.
Giordano, I don't know where he got his information. It was before there were telescopes, but he somehow understood that the Earth was in orbit around the sun, and that our sun was one of many stars. He spoke up about that. This was the Catholic Church was outraged and ultimately killed him. And I I highlighted so I could find it. It said Bruno's adventures in free thought ended when the Roman Inquisition declared him an impertinent, pertinacious, and obstinate heretic, and they killed him. They burned him at the stake. So it's an interesting, the power of the self-center is breathtaking. And I think we're slowly growing out of it. So to some degree, the same thing happened to Galileo, as we all know. They didn't kill him, but he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life when he could tell with his telescope that the Earth was clearly orbiting around the sun. And the church was still outraged. And oh yeah, and then I put in here, it took them until the 1900s, the church didn't admit that we live in a heliocentric, sun-centered solar system until the 1900s, until the 1900s. It took them 500 years. But there's a little more here about the power of identity. So this is a map of California tribal groups, and just the way that their identity was with their tribal group and then with their tribe. So here is a picture of the San Francisco Bay Area, and these are all tribes in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there were something like 100 tribes, and they would have at least different language dialects, if not different languages, slightly different customs, and probably didn't like their neighbors very much. It's a problem. And I put this in because of the trauma that's occurring on our planet right now. And I am, in particular, this is Scotland. These are clans in Scotland. So this is where we're coming from. This tendency of the mind to prefer itself and its own people that it's familiar with. I think it helps to become aware that this occurs and may help us grow up and grow out of the kind of violence that is taking place in Gaza and elsewhere on the planet. So I showed this slide and this quote last week, but I think it's worth revisiting. The main point, these are hydrogen atoms. Hydrogen atoms have one orbital and one electron in the orbital, but the orbital holds two electrons. So they share. Isn't that nice? So they tend to form a molecule H2, because then they share their electrons and they both have full orbitals. I actually did look up. I'd been meaning to get to it. I Googled why does the hydrogen orbital hold two electrons when it only has one proton? It doesn't make any sense. I couldn't get an answer. Now I'm sure there's a physicist who knows the answer to that. You can put it in chat. Doesn't make any sense to me, but the orbital holds two. The next orbital, so helium's the next element, and it has two electrons, so its orbital is full and it's inert. It doesn't react. But the next element goes into the next orbital, and that orbital holds 8. I think that's lithium. Well, lithium would only have 1 electron in that second orbital. It's going to want 7 more electrons. I mean, just the orderliness of the universe. So this quote is so good, especially into the middle part. He says this tendency to assemble, for things to come together, may mean that life is almost inevitable. The complexification of the universe is built into the atomic structure of the atoms. It's just almost gives me goosebumps. So we end up with life. Well, we don't know where life came from. This is a cartoon. This is a chemist trying to create life. And life went through all these contortions and test tubes and beakers and came out in a jar, and it comes out and says, "Are you my mommy?" It's a cartoon. How did life begin? I think I have. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. This thing just went. Oh, that's interesting. We don't know. We don't know. Let's see if it's going to work. Yeah. These are bacteria. Here's the name of them. How did life begin? You'd think with 20 million species on the planet, that's a low estimate. We would have some idea. We have no idea how life began. I mean, well, I guess we have concepts, but they really don't hold up very well. So it's a mystery. We live immersed on a mystery that the planet is full of life. I mentioned last week the number of galaxies now is through the roof. Billions, trillions. This may be the only planet with life on it. We've never seen any evidence that there's life anywhere else. So this is a little bacteria, Pelagibacter. I looked up, I Googled, what are the smallest forms of life? And this came up, and the size is unimaginably small. I have it here and I can't find it. It's just, it would be like a millionth of a millimeter. And yet not only is it a living organism, I do need to find these notes. This is called.
Say that Right Connie Fund meeting at 12:30 today, period.
This bacteria is common in the ocean, and it's hard to believe, it says the total biomass of Pelagibacter in the ocean is greater than all the fish in the sea. How is that possible? This thing, you can't even see it with a microscope, but it's alive. So life is mysterious and tenuous, but this is what has occurred from the first appearance of life, which is dated to the planet. The planet is dated at probably somewhat accurately at 4.5 billion years. There was no life for the first half billion years, and somewhere around 3.8 billion years ago, there is evidence of life that Homo sapiens, with their big brains, have figured out. It's a chemical trail of bacterial life 3.8 billion years ago. So since then, life appeared. It seems that life appeared only once. I think I have an arrow here pointing at Luca down on the bottom. At the bottom of this tree of life, it says last universal common ancestor. The acronym is LUCA. It seems as if life only appeared once and that all organisms are related. We know, I will say, human beings, Homo sapiens, all Homo sapiens are 99.9% the same, genetically exactly the same. It's all family. So the divisions that occur are psychological. The divisions that occur are this extreme hunger for identity. We all want to be somebody, especially males, because we can't have babies. That's what they say. And it may be true. And the fact that we all die is very disturbing. But it's so ecological. It's odd to me we don't get into the ecological reality of the planet. So there'll be the last program, second to the last program is on ecology. I don't know where I'm going to go with it, but it is, the flow of life and of nutrients and of energy. That's ecology. And the flow of our lives is us being embedded in ecological reality. So it'd be nice if we were ecologically literate, but it's hard to get there. So this tree of life, I think I circled prokaryotes there down low, and up above, I can't quite see it. Eukaryotes, it's blocked by something on my screen, probably not on your screen. So that was a major division. Prokaryotes are bacterial cells. There's bacteria down there on the bottom branch, but there's also something called archaea, which are non-oxidant. They're bacterial, similar to bacteria, similar size, but a taxonomist would say they're more different from bacteria than animals are from plants. So we're not going to dwell on it. The point is this life has diversified to great extremes, and the count now is about 20 million species on the planet. Nobody can count all the bacteria. It's not possible. The archaea. This is just one image of the tree of life. There are taxonomists who now divided into 20 different major life forms, but that would probably be dividing up the microscopic organisms into more groups because they have so much variation in their genomes. Anyhow, the main point here is diversification of life. There was no life. Somehow it appeared 3.8 billion years ago, and now there's 20 million species on the planet, or probably far more. A major break are these two types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We are prokaryotic organisms. All those fungi are, plants are, algae, all eukaryotic. They're just much larger cells. They're 100 times larger than bacterial cells. They're more complex. And that is a theme in the journey of life on the planet, is increasing complexity over time in many realms. Certainly on a cellular level, on the size of the organism, on the use of energy, the flow of energy. Homo sapiens is at the apex of energy consumption, as you might guess, and uses probably 20,000 times more energy than any other living organisms on the planet, because we have access to fossilized energy known as fossil fuels. So here's these two cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic. I think those are micrometers, and I have it in my notes. I never have time, never can find it or have time, but micrometer ain't much. It ain't much. You can't see bacterial cells. Well, you can't even see eukaryotic cells very well, but you can see them. Sometimes they're visible to that, but you can see in this artist conception the increase in complexity. A prokaryotic cell has no nucleus. It does have DNA, but it has a lesser amount of DNA. It doesn't have organelles. So those little turquoise blue things are mitochondria that process energy coming in hydrocarbons, also known as food. Lots of mitochondria. I think there might be 1 million mitochondria in every one of our cells. There's a very large number. So this was a evolutionary break. In fact, some of the organelles in our eukaryotic cells actually started out as bacteria. And they were taken in by the larger cell. The large cell was probably trying to engulf it and eat it. And that smaller cell began to function in the larger cell. It's symbiotic, it's endosymbiotic, symbiotic inside of the other organism. So it's a journey, and it's certainly the journey is still going on. I think that's an important thing to remember, given the troubles on the planet right now, is that we're still on this evolutionary journey. It's still an emergent universe. The moment I wish I hadn't put this in because it's complex. But where did this diversity come from? Part of it came up from the way that DNA genetic recombination in sexual reproduction. And basically, our chromosomes are paired. That's what it says there in the text. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes in almost every one of our cells. They are paired, one from our mother and one from our father. During sexual reproduction, they first reproduce. So instead of a pair, there's 4, and then they separate into separate units and then recombine with the other sex during sexual reproduction. And at the same time, there's also been some crossing over, which I wrote in here, hanky-panky, because in that third picture, there's been some crossing over of genetic material from the originally male donor and female donor, so that it just mixes up the DNA, so the offspring are all varied. The offspring are all varied. We know that from our children. But the remarkable thing is, so this is sexual reproduction. This is an orchid capsule. Well, we only have one or two children at a time. Orchids can produce as many as 1,000,000 seeds in one seed capsule. They have these, when they reproduce, they have a glob of pollen on the flower called a pollinia. And that glob has as many as 1,000,000 pollen cells with the DNA from the parent plant that recombines during sexual reproduction and produces as many as 1,000,000 offspring. What are you going to do with 1,000,000 offspring from two parent plants? Well, most of them don't survive. In fact, orchids don't supply any food, any endosperm. You could not live by eating orchid seeds the way you can live by eating walnuts and coconuts, because they don't have any food in them, because they either germinate immediately and enter actually into a symbiotic relationship with fungi who supply them with food, or they die. And most of them die because there aren't all that many orchids out there. So trying to get a sense of the span of time, say we compress the 4.5 billion years of the history of the Earth into a year, 4.5 billion years, and pulled up a few things. Down at the bottom, there's a little bit of a measurement there. What says 4.8 billion years. So each month is 400 million years. Each day is 13 million years. Let's see if I can remember. So I circled April 8th. That is the appearance of life on the planet. So if the journey of the planet were condensed into 1 year, there was no life for the first 3 months. Life somehow appeared. It would have been microscopic, would have been bacterial or archaean, but still adequately complex to be alive. We don't know how it happened. But for 3 months, there was no life on Earth. The second one, July 2nd, is that's photosynthesis. There was no photosynthesis. So where we're living things, photosynthesis is the primary source of producing food on the planet. As you know, and we'll talk about briefly in next slide or one of the forthcoming slides, it takes the energy of the sun and stores the energy of the sun in chemical bonds, and it becomes food. The food we eat has the energy of the sun in the chemical bonds. That's why we eat the food. And our bodies are able, through those mitochondria in our cells, are able to strip that energy and give us life. Well, there was no photosynthesis for the first half of the history of the planet. So what were they eating? Well, they were breaking apart chemical bonds that just existed due to chemistry, and were able to strip some energy out of those chemical bonds. But photosynthesis was the all-time great invention of life on the planet, because it creates 99% of the food on the planet. That makes all the other life possible. Oh, I already pulled up that one. So December 1st, that's life on land. For 12 months, for 11 months of the history of the Earth, there was no life on land. And the last one is Homo sapiens. And what it actually says in my notes is, if we went on this compressed time scale, then Homo sapiens appeared at 11:30 on the last day of the last month. We haven't been here very long. So we're a new species on the planet. We're certainly making an impact. These are stromatolites. These are living structures. This is, oops, sorry, 2 A's in Australia. Sorry about that. These are some of the very first life forms. They can't have been the first because they have complexity, and they can't have started out complex, but these are mineral structures like piles of sand glued together by cyanobacteria, which are blue-green bacteria that I forget the details about cyanobacteria, but that is some of the earliest life forms on the planet. They would have just first been single cells living in water, but they began to create these structures which would have been somewhat protective. They can glue these sand grains together, almost like, analogous to corals, there's living organisms in these structures, but they're protected by the mineral elements that they pull in around them, and they create these growing globs of mineral material up to 10 feet tall. So here is a boardwalk in this field of stromatolites in Australia. And it's funny to me, I think I put in here exciting boardwalk, because they don't move. I'm not going to see any action. You'd have to use your mind. Your mind would have to have an idea of what these stromatolites are about. Anyhow, early life form, stromatolites. I just read this morning, there are stromatolites in Capitol Reef National Park. Is that, I think, in Utah? So we have, I mean, they're not alive, they're fossils, but it was an interior, it was an ocean. Utah was part of the interior seaway, and there were stromatolites there at one time. Photosynthesis, one of my favorite phenomena on the planet. We know the basics. Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes in through the leaf, water not so much. Water comes up from the roots. Energy is absorbed by the leaf and captured in a chemical bond. And then what happens? Well, the carbon dioxide and the water, the plant uses the energy of the sun to break the water molecule apart. It liberates the hydrogen. It releases the oxygen into the atmosphere. Combines the hydrogen with carbon dioxide. You wouldn't think you'd end up with sugar, but you do. C6H12O6, that's glucose. Plants are making sugar, and then they can turn that into more complex molecules after that. The oxygen is released. Well, that sugar, as we know, has energy stored in the hydrocarbon bond. That can be broken apart by the oxygen that's released into the atmosphere. So it's created a battery. It's created a life battery. The energy is in the plant material, and the element with the energy to break that bond apart is in the atmosphere. And when they come together, you either get digestion if we eat the food, or fire. I lit the fire this morning. It wasn't burning very well, and I blew on it. Why? To get more oxygen to the hydrocarbons, and it took off. So this is a great quote at the very bottom there in that rainbow thing. That's by Lynn Margulis, famous Lynn Margulis. She passed away some years ago. Photosynthesis is the most important single innovation in the history of life on the planet. Somehow life figured out how to capture the energy of the sun in chemical bonds. Well, life needs carbon dioxide as a raw material. It's carbon dioxide and water, as we just saw. How's it going to get the carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere. It takes it in through stomata. The word stoma means mouth. I think stomata means little mouth. Well, that looks like the stomata look like little mouths. Carbon dioxide is taken in through the leaves through these little mouths. And an interesting aspect of the evolutionary journey of plants is the number of stomata in leaves has increased greatly in the last 100 million years. Now, why would that be? The reason is the level of carbon dioxide has dropped precipitously from even 3,000 parts per million to currently 400 parts per million. I know we're totally freaking out about 400 parts per million, but the plants. So there's this quote by, a PhD botanist who says it's as if plants are gasping for air. What's their air? It's carbon dioxide. They don't need oxygen. They need carbon dioxide. They do need oxygen, but they need carbon dioxide more, because that's what they make their plant structure out of. It's a little different perspective on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I don't know if different perspectives are allowed, but it's interesting. So this is biomass on the planet. 450 gigatons. They always say carbon. I wish they wouldn't do that, but they do. I believe in tried gigatons. That's a billion tons, a billion metric tons, 450 billion metric tons of plant material on the planet. Where did it come from? What's it made out of? Made out of carbon dioxide, 90% carbon dioxide. The biosphere is appearing out of the atmosphere. It's a magical mystery tour. It's totally a magical mystery tour. All of the other organisms, which are there in different colors, are just a hangnail on the plants, because the plants produce the food. So we're down there at the bottom. The animals eat the plants, fungi eat the plants, protists eat the plants, bacteria eat the plants. It's all dependent on photosynthesis. So biomass on the planet, well, there was none. Remember, this has emerged over time, this huge amount of biomass on the planet, largely due to photosynthesis. So this, some of you have seen this, me refer to this before. If you Google, in YouTube, you Google photosynthesis at MIT, you'll get this character here. It's a short video. There's a longer version, but the short version is about 10 minutes. They're asking, these are graduates of MIT, and in the beginning they say, we are the premier engineering school on the planet. And then these interviewers from Harvard come and ask them about biomass. So the interviewer has handed him that piece of wood that he's holding, and he's got a seed. He said it came from this seed. And he's got a seed in his hand. He's got a chunk of firewood. And the interviewer says, where did that biomass come from? And this illustrious graduate of MIT says, dirt. The plants are sucking up dirt. So would say are not sucking up dirt. There's no hole at the base of plants or trees. It's carbon dioxide. It's astonishing. And nobody knows it. Ask your neighbor what plants are made out of, and they won't know. So there are a number of good videos on this, and this is the best one. It's the most basic fact of life that biomass is made 90% of carbon dioxide, and almost nobody knows it, and I can't get over it. Photosynthesis, a good invention. That's what's happening. It's creating an earth battery. Energy of the sun is in chemical hydrocarbon bonds, and oxygen's released in the atmosphere. You recombine them, the energy of the sun is given off, either in your body or fire or somewhere. So see, the oxygen's given to the atmosphere. Well, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere on the early Earth. That's 1 billion years ago, bottom left. It goes to the present. Presently, the level of carbon dioxide or oxygen in the atmosphere is 21%, but it had gone much higher, 35%, and that big spike there. I mentioned last week, if the oxygen, you imagine we can barely put out these forest fires at 21% oxygen. When I wanted my fire to burn this morning, I blew on it. At 35% oxygen, you would not be able to put out fires. Well, there wasn't as much biomass on land at that time, but the land, if we went back to our calendar, life began to colonize land about 400 million years ago. So it's just interesting. And of course, it's in spite of our failings as a species, and look at our brilliance. There's no other animal on the planet that is figuring out the historical past history of the planet through chemical analysis of ice cores and fossil rocks. It's just, we're a stunning species. We just need a little more progress and we'll be fine. So ozone, we know there's an ozone layer. We know it's had a little bit of trouble. It's mostly in good shape right now. What's it made out of? It's made out of oxygen. It's an O3. It says down there at the bottom. I forget. Oxygen probably usually forms O2. Remember, it's got to fill its second electron shell. I mean, it's mysterious, but it's very simple. So oxygen has 8 protons, which means it has 8 electrons. So the first 2 go in the first shell, and the other 6 go in the second shell. Well, the second shell holds 8. Anybody can do this. So it wants 2 more. So it joins together with hydrogen. How about hydrogen? How about H2O? You get water. See, it's a natural emergence of the structure of the universe for this complexification to occur. And ozone forms somehow, I forget the chemistry of it. It's a little complicated. I got in my notes, it says something about it's a reaction of oxygen with hydrocarbons and nitrogen in the atmosphere. Well, the only reason there's nitrogen in the atmosphere is because nitrogen, and they're not nitrogen fixing bacteria, they're nitrogen breakdown, they're decomposing bacteria, release nitrogen into the atmosphere. I forget the level of nitrogen. I forget. If oxygen's, it's high. Oh, nitrogen's 79%. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. It's put there by life. What that indicated to me when I read that the ozone layer was created by an interaction of nitrogen and hydrocarbons, which I also could not totally get straight on. it made it seem like the ozone layer is a byproduct of life on the planet. Well, the ozone layer protects life on the planet. It's almost as if it's symbiotic, that they work together, because the ozone layer blocks at least ultraviolet B, which I think is the more destructive of the ultraviolet lights. Ultraviolet B is the one that burns our skin. It's a very high energy wave, and it's destructive to living cells. We would have far more cancer if it weren't for the ozone layer. Well, the ozone layer may in part be a byproduct of life pumping those elements into the atmosphere. Banded iron formations, BIFs, banded iron formations. That's a banded iron formation in the upper left. That's iron and silica, and iron and silica, and iron and silica. It's a band. And then a rock, I think that's in Australia, the picture. But you can see that it's a banded sedimentary rock, and it's red. It's iron. Iron. This is a byproduct of life pumping oxygen into the planet. I said that because I'm trying to avoid the word atmosphere, because the first oxygenating organisms, the first photosynthetic organisms were in the ocean, and the oxygen was pumped into the ocean, not the atmosphere. The ocean had to be oxygenated before the atmosphere was. Well, that oxygen's very reactive, and it reacted with iron in the water and created iron oxide, which then becomes a solid and precipitates out as a sediment and created these banded iron formations. So now most of the iron that we mine comes from banded iron formations, which is a result of oxygen, of life. It's a byproduct of life. These are red beds. We know these exist in the Southwest, and I put them in because it's another reaction of oxygen being pumped into this geosphere, the Earth system. The first oxygen went into the ocean, then oxygen went into the atmosphere, reacted with the iron. Well, it wasn't iron in the atmosphere, but it was iron associated with these sandstones and turned the sandstone red. But it's a indication of the oxygenation of the atmosphere. That's why those rocks are red. So we finally get to plants. Wow, look at that. Oh my. Well, we're going to have to speed up. So these are plants. These are early plant forms. And they generally are small. Mosses don't tend to get very big. Mosses don't have vascular system. They cannot lift water very high because they don't have plumbing. So they never get very big. That's true also for liverworts and hornworts. The stonewort actually has some size to it because it's aquatic. It lives in the water. So it doesn't have to lift water. It lives in water. Stoneworts are very common in the Methow, in our lakes. When I drop an anchor and pick it up, the anchor's covered with stoneworts and they stink. So you're going to see several of these. They look kind of complicated. Over here on the left side, these are the plant divisions. So we have stoneworts, which is an algae, but it's very rough to the touch because it's full of silica, probably as a defense against herbivory, against herbivores eating it. Liverworts, hornworts, mosses. So then I related this to the Methow. In this column here, it has the number in the Methow. How many stoneworts? Well, nobody knows. Liverworts, the botanists have been at work. 75 have been ID'd, so there's a guess here. That would be my guess for liverworts. Well, again, we're going to see this for even flowering plants and how many conifers when it comes up. Mosses, 200 have been identified. There might be 250. That's probably my guess. These are characteristics of these plants. Do they have a vascular system? No. No X's. Do they create pollen? No. How do they reproduce? Well, they reproduce with a tailed gamete. The male sex cell swims to the female. Why? Well, they live in water. That's why. As I enjoy saying, the tailed male reproducing with a flagellated gamete is a very primitive way of reproducing. That's a little bit of a joke. So they don't have pollen, they don't have seeds, they don't have lignin. So this is an evolutionary journey. As we pull up more plants, they do. Oh yeah, how many hornworts in the Methow? None. I've never heard of a hornwort. That's this strange little creature down here. So I don't know why. There's only 100 on the planet, whereas there's 26,000 mosses. So here's a moss. Very common. I happen to know this is a moss called Grimmia. It grows on the rocks everywhere around here. And these are reproductive structures called sporophytes, those little cute little balls. They form in March when the snow melts, because these mosses live on rocks that are dry from April to when it rains, if it rains in October and November. But they do reproduce. They do reproduce with sporophytes. Here's a dried out, 4 dried out sporophytes. The little lid has popped off, and the spores come out. They have teeth that, when they get wet, the teeth fold into the capsule, and when they dry, they come back out and carry the spores out. So they go in, they go out, and they release the spores to the atmosphere. Some other creatures, lichens. Well, we know lichens exist. We know they're beautiful. There's some little information down at the bottom. 200 known in the Methow, 400 total. Lichens are symbiotic. This is a rock. It's this rock. Look, I have this rock right here in person. I've had so much. This is from my yard. It's a granite cobble. It's a surprisingly heavy rock. It's just a piece of granite. I got it outside. It's covered with life. I've identified 10 different species of lichens on this rock. You saw it's only 8 inches inside, and 2 of them are endolithic. So I think I circled this red one here. This is the reproductive structure of the lichen, but the actual body of the lichen is nowhere to be found. Where is it? It's inside the granite. And this black one, those are reproductive structures. The thallus, the photosynthetic portion of the lichen is nowhere to be seen. Maybe it is. Maybe it's this dark color here, but life lives inside rocks right here in the Methow Valley. Who would have thought? So we're on the evolutionary journey here. We've added another X to our line because life is emergent. It changes over time and complexifies over time. I think it's fair to say. First organisms were microscopic. Now we have blue whales, which are bigger than trucks, So they've added a vascular system. Well, there are ferns, as we know, there are ferns that are trees that grow 30 feet tall. And so what they're doing is they are colonizing living space on the planet. Life started in the water. It slowly emerged onto land. It was the size of algae and mosses. They couldn't grow upwards. Now there's ferns that are 30 feet tall. They're competing for what? The energy of the sun. They're competing for the energy of the sun. But no pollen. So an interesting thing about ferns is, let's see, they produce spores, which is asexual reproduction on the undersides of the leaves. You may have seen little sporophytes that often exist on the underside of these leaves, but they do reproduce sexually. They have a tailed gamete here, a male with a tail that swims in water. So the funny thing is about this, there are tree ferns that are 30 feet tall. How is a male gamete going to swim to a female on another tree? I'll leave that for you to figure out. We're on an evolutionary journey here, but the thing is, these are all Methow plants. So the whole evolutionary story of life on the planet is retold in the Methow Valley. I just love the fact that that's the case. We don't have all of the different kinds of plants, but we have examples of the evolutionary journey as we've been looking at. Conifers are another example of a change over time. Here's their little prospectus here. Interestingly enough, there's only 600 species of conifers on the planet. I forget if there were many more and they've been pushed out of the limelight by flowering plants, but they dominate large swaths of the land. All the northern tier of Earth is covered with conifers. There might be flowering plants under them, but the boreal forest is all coniferous. So what they've made a little progress here in the complexification of life. They have pollen. So they don't have to have their poor little male gametes swim to the female. It just blows through the air. They produce seeds. That infers that the seed probably is supplied with food. Not true for orchids, but true for most seeds. So you don't have to if you can germinate and have some food supply to tide you over for a few weeks, wood, lignin. These are male cones. They produce the pollen. The pollen blows through the air and gets to the female cone. Here's a mature female cone, but up here, right here, if you can see my cursor, is a little new cone of the year, and this is what it looks like close up. So this is waiting for pollen to arrive through the atmosphere. Here it is flying through the atmosphere. I took this at home back in 2011. I thought there was a fire. I thought there was a forest fire. This is all pollen. So that's what they do. They just cast these trees past billions of pollen grains into the atmosphere. It's just totally by chance that they reach the sticky receptive portion of a female cone and are able to then pollinate that cone and create seeds, and only one seed for one pollen grain. So obviously these cones, as we know, have multiple ovaries. Every one of those little divots there leads to another ovary. So the problem with when pollination works, it allowed conifers to colonize the uplands. You can even see a few conifers up on this hill. They don't need water to reproduce. Why? Because the pollen just goes everywhere, but it's wasteful. Life doesn't tend to be overly wasteful, but pollination, wind pollination is wasteful. So are there options? Well, you can't have animals on land until you have plants. Plants make the food. Well, once there were plants, the animals slithered out of the water and began to find ways to consume those plants and harvest the energy of the sun stored in the hydrocarbon bonds. Was at home, kind of a terrifying plant. These are armyworms. But it's life on land, but not all flowering plants are insect or animal pollinated. There are wind pollinated flowering plants. And there's 3 of them here. Alder, those are male cones on all 3 of these. And these also produce pollen, but they're considered flowering plants at the moment. I can't quite remember what makes them flowering plants. It's true for willows too. These are male catkins on a Sitka willow on the above. And by the way, those catkins can be quite beautiful, as the Sitka willows are. They don't stay red, but they're red when they first open. But willow catkins produce a very small amount. The pollen is carried by the wind, but they also produce a small amount of pollen, and they are a step in the journey towards insect pollination. So if you in the spring in early April, in the Methow, when these willows flower and produce these male catkins, they are live with life. They just buzz with insects because it is the first food source available to the insects, both the pollen and the small amount of nectar at the base of every floret. Those are tiny little flowers, and it's a tiny amount of nectar. So this is the journey of plant life over time, starting with 400 million years ago on the left and going to the present on the right. Ferns colonized land before there were conifers or flowers. Conifers were a new idea. I don't know if they were a better idea. What did we have? How many do we have? Was it 600 species on the planet? That's not very many. There's a lot more fern species than there are conifer species. But conifers dominate the canopy and intercept most of the sunlight, which is the name of the game. Well, flowering plants somehow had a better idea in terms of diversity, because there are 600 species of conifers on the planet. There are 300,000 species of flowering plants. So in terms of diversity, they've taken over the planet, if not biomass. Here's our same lineup of organisms. These are all in the Methow except for hornworts. No hornworts in the Methow. There's only 100 hornworts on the planet. Well, this is too much to look at right now, but it's interesting information here, like how many of these on the planet. Let's go. Well, I said flowering plants, 300,000 down here at the bottom. How many flowering plants in the Methow? For me, I always am interested to know, well, how do these things compare? 14 species of conifers in the Methow. That's not very many, but I bet none of us could name the 14. And then I put in that red line to show a general trend towards increasing complexity over time. And the only one that has, well, the only one that has flowers are flowering plants, goes without saying. But wood, conifers have wood, ginkgos have wood. How many ginkgos on the planet? One. How many in the Methow? None. You could plant them here, but they wouldn't survive. I'm sure they can't take the cold winters. Oh yeah, I put a bunch of zeros here. Anyhow, we need to move along. I don't know why it started over. This is the end result. Look at what's happened on the planet. 300,000 species of flowers. They're not all colorful, but plenty of them are. None of that color was there before there were flowers on the planet. So what is going on the planet? We don't know we don't know how life first appeared. We don't know how the orderliness at the atomic level, why it exists, and we don't know why there's this drift towards increasing beauty on the planet, except in certain parts of the planet. So flowers, so this is our basic flower. I'm not going to dwell on it. We know basically these parts, it's always nice to be reminded. The point for me at the moment is if there's 300,000 species of flowering plants on the planet, there are 300,000 variations on this theme. They all flower, by definition, every species is different than every other species. And generally, the species classification is based on the flower. Not totally, now it's also done with DNA. But here are some examples of just different flowers, different ways to be a flower. The top one is a buttercup. If you pull off the petal of a buttercup, it's got a little nectar. You can see it with your bare eye at the base of every petal. That is the bribe for the insect to come pick up the nectar. Well, look at where its head's going to go. Its head's going to go right into the anthers and the stigmas and pick up nectar, pick up pollen of one flower and bring it to another one. It's infinitely more economical than wind pollination. What else here? This is a columbine. Columbine has nectar at the back, in the very back of that deep nectary. Well, that means not every insect can get there. Any insect can reach the nectar in a buttercup. Not so in a columbine. This is a monk's hood down at the bottom. The nectary is up inside the hood. I think we're going to go, well, at some point we go to monk's hood. So how to be a flower? Well, you can be radial. You can be round like a wheel. You can be bilateral. Bilaterals are more recently evolved, and they limit who can pollinate them. So there are advantages to being a pollination generalist. That's like a helicopter landing pad. Any insect can land on a flower like that that's wide open. The bilateral, you can't even see the reproductive structures. They're up inside the hood. They're hard to reach. Only certain insects pollinate bilateral flowers. Insects vary greatly. Flies have short tongues. Hoverflies have medium length tongues. Butterflies have very long tongues. Well, this leads to symbiotic evolutionary journey for flowers. There are flowers like, I forget the name of this bee. It's my favorite little bee. It keeps its pollen on its abdomen. Isn't that darling? Mega chile. We have these in the Methow. They store their pollen. It's just a variation on a theme. So insects and flowers have co-evolved. Well, there's some advantage to only being pollinated by one insect, and that is true for this Agricum orchid. Missed an I there in the word orchid, which is tropical. We don't have this in the Methow, but it has a nectary that is almost a foot long. So somebody sent this to Darwin, probably in the 1860s, and he said, well, there has to be an insect with a proboscis that's almost a foot long, because there'd be no reason to have a flower with a nectary that long. Well, it wasn't until after he died that this moth was found with this proboscis, which I tried to put the red line in there. The proboscis is somewhat visible in that picture. Sure enough, it exists. It's the only insect alive that can pollinate that flower. So some flowers are specialists, some flowers are generalists. For some of our flowers in the Methow, this is an interesting flower, this Gilia, which I guess is Ipomopsis now. A lot of our plants are changing their scientific names to the chagrin of aging botanists. Let's see, red is not so visible to insects and highly visible to birds. The interesting thing to me about this plant, this is on the road up to Tiffany, right on the edge of, it's a road cut, and it is covered with this scarlet gilia, because scarlet gilia is basically a colonizer plant. You could call it a weed. It's native, but it likes disturbed soil. It grows well in disturbed soil. Therefore, it grows very well in front of my house. All you have to do is throw the seeds out, and it grows great. It's so I have a lot of it in front of my house, so if you're tubular and red, you're going to be pollinated by a hummingbird. So I pulled up the hummingbird there, and I sit on the porch and watch them pollinate these gilias, which are so easy to grow. So a side note there, as I mentioned before, is you can start exercising that enjoyable phenomenon of trying to interpret these flowers. Why are they the shape they are? What are their likely symbiotic pollinator species? So you can ask that question about tiger lilies. Well, look at the anthers sticking way the heck out there. Well, the stigma's out there too. It just makes it easy to access. I'm not 100% sure what pollinates this. I did look it up, and it said they're commonly pollinated by hummingbirds. This is a common flower in the Methow, in the understory of the forest. Shooting stars. Shooting stars are unusual flowers because we are almost done. I see it's 10. Shooting stars have their petals swept backwards. Usually the petals embrace the flower. These are swept backwards, but the anthers point forward. And so the anthers are just bared, just out there, available to the insect, but they only open through a tiny hole in the tip. They only open through a pore like a salt shaker. So to get the pollen out of the anthers of a shooting star, you have to vibrate it at just about the vibrations of middle C. You can take a middle C tuning fork and hold it on there. If they're ripe, the pollen will come flying out. So bumblebees happen to be experts at vibrating their wing muscles at just about middle C and gathering the pollen. So it limits who can, among the insects, the bumblebees are the most trustworthy pollinators. They will go from one shooting star to another for hours at a time, and therefore successfully pollinate. You can't carry the pollen from one species to another species. It just won't work. So you need trustworthy pollinators. So shooting stars have evolved this mechanism. This is monk's hood, beautiful but strange flower. Up inside the hood here is the nectary. But to get in there, you have to shove your way in through this little opening. And in the process, you go over the anthers and the female stigmas, probably multiple stigmas in there, can't see them. Well, this is what happens. This bee has shoved its way in through the hood and gotten to the nectary here. And it's covered itself with pollen, but also gets the nectar reward. But cheating exists in the world, and bees will just sometimes, once they get to know the flower, they just bite a hole in the hood rather than having to struggle through here. So it's interesting that aspects of life that we're not too fond of with Homo sapiens exists in the natural world as well. This is probably that bunch of lady slippers on the Dripping Springs Trail. There's a big clump of them there. So orchids are bilateral. That by definition means they limit who pollinates them. Orchids are usually very specific to their pollinators. And I mentioned when they produce pollen, they produce it in a clump. They can have up to 1 million pollen grains in a pollinium. In one clump, the insect will enter into this bulb here and actually can't get out. It gets in there and it can't get out, and it has to go out through a trapdoor in the back of the flower. And as it does it, the flower glues the pollinia onto the head of the insect. So here is a bee with 2 pollinia glued onto his head. Well, they don't have very big brains, so they go to another cypripedium, and it's picked up by the stigma here, and it pollinates multiple eggs inside, up to 1 million in one flower. Last flower, I added this at the end, and now I wish I hadn't, just because we're running out of time. But what's going on? So the orchid family is one of the 2 largest families in the world. I forget which family's ahead now, the orchid family or the composite family, also known as the aster family. This is the aster family. We know this is balsam root. It was called the composite family. Why? Because all those little dots in the middle of the flower are tiny flowers on their own right. Here's a picture. Here's a composite head, but all these little dots are made up of these little tiny flowers. They have petals. They have anthers, they have a female stigma, they have an ovary down at the base down here at the seed, and there's dozens to 100. So this increases genetic biodiversity because every little flower is going to be pollinated by a different pollen grain, possibly from a different flower. So what you've done is maximize the potential for the diversity in offspring. The stamens are fused together. I put a little line here to show them they're fused together. But this is so fun to look at with a hand lens, and who knew? So the petals are not petals. They're not actually petals in the composite. They're called ligules, which means strap, and they have a flower on them. But they're usually only a female flower. There's only a stigma and there's a seed, and it can pick up pollen, but it doesn't generate any pollen. But in the middle, they're complete. They have males and females. Anyhow, they're fun to look at. And who knew? There was all this complexity. So this picture, I was just surprised when I started thinking about Lewisia, how many species we have in the Methow. There's 5 species of Lewisia. Who knew? They changed bitterroot to Lewisiopsis, but I'm resisting it. I don't like that name. Anyhow, these are great flowers. This Lewisia pygmaea grows on the trail, on the Tiffany Trail when you hike up to Tiffany. It's not always so easy to see. I think some of these other ones, Tweedy Eye's around. Triphylla, I think, is the one I've only seen at Boiling Lake, not right at the lake, but near Boiling Lake on the big rock pile there. And I can't see that one. Olisvia columbiana, very common on our rocks, grows on granite outcrops all over. Hopefully the last one. Look at this rock face. If you're a botanist and you see this, you go right over to it because it's an unusual habitat. It's an austere habitat. It might have something unusual. There was a little plant right here. See that little green spot? Little green spot the size of a penny. It turned out to be a saxifrage that only grows in the Olympic Mountains. But this is at I can't remember the name of the lake. If I think of it, I'll say it. It's yeah, I can't remember. Anyhow, we found it in the Methow, and I could tell it was. I looked for the book and I couldn't find it, and I saw that it had this double stigma, this double female portion, and so when I sent it to the herbarium and I said, we have some kind of saxifrage here. I don't know what it is, but it was only known previously in the Olympics, and now here it is in the Methow. And I think the last flower, two of my favorites, Alpine Forget-Me-Not, you have to go up to Hoodoo Pass and up to the ridge, and you get to see this Alpine Forget-Me-Not, which is a disjunct. It doesn't grow anywhere else in our area except right here in the Methow near Hoodoo Pass. And Snowdoglossia, they grow together, very beautiful, but they're tiny. And if you want to see them, you have to get down on your hands and knees like that. So plants. So emergent properties of plants. I showed you that picture of biomass. Most of the biomass on the planet are plants, at least on land, not so much in the ocean. We talked about this. Plants totally change the chemistry of the atmosphere. It's 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, both put there by living organisms. The nitrogen is not put there by plants, but we'll skip that. Plants are geologic force. I showed you rocks that are made by oxygen created by photosynthesis reacting with loose iron and even other elements, and they precipitate out and create sedimentary rock. Plants make terrestrial animal life possible. There would be no animal life on land without plants. They create all the food. Fossil fuels, I have a fire going in Douglas fir burning right now. It's made by plants. Human ancestors, we spent 80 million years, not as Homo sapiens, but as primates, swinging around in plants before we came down to the ground. And it's hypothesized that it was the increasing energy available from learning to cook food using plants for the fire made more nutrients available that allowed the rapid expansion of the human brain. So we are a byproduct of plants. These are pollen grains. They're probably colorized, but the shape has not changed. So here at a microscopic level, shown could be in even I guess you could, I don't know, it'd take a true microscope, not a dissecting scope, to see these shapes. Beautiful. They're beautiful on all levels. Life on Earth is beautiful. So Teilhard de Chardin said, the purpose of life is ever more perfect eyes, in which there's always more to see. There is always more to see. All the wild world is beautiful. It doesn't matter where we go. And all John Muir needed to get ready for an adventure was to jump over the back fence. I love that. Don't forget the Methow naturalists. We're on year 29. Saporade, a little bit of advice there. The end. Thanks for those of you who survived.
Wow.
I don't know why it's fun to
Woo!
talk. Yeah, it's a lot.
Thank you, Dana.
What a
Thanks a lot.
journey. What a journey. Thank you, Dana. That's
Yeah,
like
it
a
is.
feat.
It is a journey, and it's interesting that none of that is obvious to us. I mean, I look out, and it's there's land, and there's a few scraggly plants, and a couple inches of snow, and that whole story of how this has traveled through time and space has been unraveled by Homo sapiens. I mean, how could we be so brilliant and so stupid at the same time? It's a great mystery.
Well, like you said, we used to put the earth at the center of everything. And I think that, eventually like this anthropocentrism,
Yeah,
humans putting
that's
this humans at the
yeah,
center of everything, I think evolutionarily we will either adapt or we will no longer exist if we can't get past that, I would say. But
right. And it's not our fault. I mean, organisms are, biologically, genetically programmed to survive. That's also known
right.
as being self-centered. So our journey, I think Homo sapiens, you can make a case that Homo sapiens are unique and on their own evolutionary journey, but there's no guarantees. We're not doing a great job, but we're trying. Ron McLean,
Absolutely.
was it
And
Ron McLean? Ron McLean used to say, I'm doing the best I can with what I've got.
right. Well, wow. Thank you for helping us to develop ever more perfect eyes, to really, ask different questions and look a little bit deeper at all the life forms that surround us. So,
Thank you, Tracy,
uh,
for hosting.
yeah. And you should definitely, there's so many beautiful comments in the chat here.
Oh,
Just a lot of gratitude
thanks for
for
pointing that out.
you
I'll take a look at them. Oh yeah.
and uh and your work. So really appreciate the time that you put in to present this to us. Thanks. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.